Section 1 of Signs of Change by William Morris. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Deborah Brabin. Signs of Change by William Morris. Section 1, How We Live and How We Might Live, Part 1. The word revolution, which we socialists are so often forced to use, has a terrible sound in most people's ears, even when we have explained to them that it does not necessarily mean a change accompanied by riot and all kinds of violence, and cannot mean a change made mechanically and in the teeth of opinion by a group of men who have somehow managed to seize on the executive power for the moment. Even when we explain that we use the word revolution in its etymological sense, and mean by it a change in the basis of society, people are scared at the idea of such a vast change, and beg that you will speak of reform and not revolution. As, however, we socialists do not at all mean by our word revolution what these worthy people mean by their word reform, I can't help thinking that it would be a mistake to use it, whatever projects we might conceal beneath its harmless envelope. So we will stick to our word, which means a change of the basis of society. It may frighten people, but it will at least warn them that there is something to be frightened about, which will be no less dangerous for being ignored. And also it may encourage some people, and will mean to them at least not a fear, but a hope. Fear and hope. Those are the names of the two great passions which rule the race of man, and with which revolutionists have to deal. To give hope to the many oppressed and fear to the few oppressors, that is our business. If we do the first and give hope to the many, the few must be frightened by their hope. Otherwise we do not want to frighten them. It is not revenge we want for poor people, but happiness. Indeed, what revenge can be taken for all the thousands of years of the sufferings of the poor? However, many of the oppressors of the poor, most of them, we will say, are not conscious of their being oppressors. We shall see why presently. They live in an orderly, quiet way themselves, as far as possible removed from the feelings of a Roman slave owner or a legree. They know that the poor exist, but their sufferings do not present themselves to them in a trenchant and dramatic way. They themselves have troubles to bear, and they think doubtless that to bear trouble is the lot of humanity. Nor have they any means of comparing the troubles of their lives with those of people lower in the social scale. And if ever the thought of those heavier troubles obtrudes itself upon them, they console themselves with the maxim that people do get used to the troubles they have to bear, whatever they might be. Indeed, as far as regards individuals at least, that is but too true. So that we have, as supporters of the present state of things, however bad it may be, first those comfortable unconscious oppressors who think that they have everything to fear from any change which would involve more than the softest and most gradual of reforms, and secondly those poor people who, living hard and anxiously as they do, can hardly conceive of any change for the better happening to them, and dare not risk one tittle of their poor possessions in taking any action towards a possible bettering of their condition. So that, while we can do little with the rich save inspire them with fear, it is hard indeed to give the poor any hope. It is then no less than reasonable that those whom we try to involve in the great struggle for a better form of life than that which we now lead, should call on us to give them at least some idea of what that life may be like. A reasonable request, but hard to satisfy, since we are living under a system that makes conscious effort towards reconstruction almost impossible. It is not unreasonable on our part to answer, there are certain definite obstacles to the real progress of man. We can tell you what these are. Take them away, and then you shall see. However, I purpose now to offer myself as a victim for the satisfaction of those who consider that, as things now go, we have at least got something, and are terrified at the idea of losing their hold of that, lest they should find they are worse off than before and have nothing. Yet in the course of my endeavour to show how we might live, I must more or less deal in negatives. I mean to say I must point out where, in my opinion, we fall short in our present attempts at decent life. I must ask the rich and well-to-do what sort of a position it is which they are so anxious to preserve at any cost, and if, after all, it will be such a terrible loss to them to give it up. And I must point out to the poor that they, with capacities for living a dignified and generous life, are in a position which they cannot endure without continued degradation. How do we live then under our present system? Let us look at it a little. And first, please to understand that our present system of society is based on a state of perpetual war. Do any of you think that this is as it should be? I know that you have often been told that the competition, which is at present the rule of all production, is a good thing and stimulates the progress of the race. But the people who tell you this should call competition by its shorter name of war if they wish to be honest, and you would then be free to consider whether or no war stimulates progress, otherwise than as a mad bull chasing you over your own garden may do. War or competition, whichever you please to call it, means at the best pursuing your own advantage at the cost of someone else's loss. And in the process of it you must not be sparing of destruction even of your own possessions, or you will certainly come by the worse in the struggle. You understand that perfectly as to the kind of war in which people go out to kill and be killed. That sort of war in which ships are commissioned, for instance, to sink, burn and destroy. But it appears that you are not so conscious of this waste of goods when you are only carrying on that other war called commerce. Observe, however, that the waste is there all the same. Now let us look at this kind of war a little closer. Run through some of the forms of it, that we may see how the burn, sink and destroy is carried on in it. First you have that form of it called national rivalry, which in good truth is nowadays the cause of all gunpowder and bayonet wars which civilized nations wage. For years past we English have been rather shy of them, except on those happy occasions when we could carry them on at no sort of risk to ourselves, when the killing was all on one side, or at all events when we hoped it would be. We have been shy of gunpowder war with a respectable enemy for a long while, and I will tell you why. It is because we have had the lion's share of the world market. We didn't want to fight for it as a nation, for we had got it. But now this is changing in a most significant and, to a socialist, a most cheering way. We are losing or have lost that lion's share. It is now a desperate competition between the great nations of civilization for the world market, and tomorrow it may be a desperate war for that end. As a result, the furthering of war, if it be not on too large a scale, is no longer confined to the honour and glory kind of old Tories, who, if they meant anything at all by it, meant that a Tory war would be a good occasion for damping down democracy. We have changed all that, and now it is quite another kind of politician that is wont to urge us on to patriotism, as 'tis called. The leaders of the progressive liberals, as they would call themselves. Long-headed persons who know well enough that social movements are going on, who are not blind to the fact that the world will move with their help or without it. These have been the jingos of these later days. I don't mean to say they know what they are doing. Politicians, as you well know, take good care to shut their eyes to everything that may happen 6 months ahead. But what is being done is this, that the present system, which always must include national rivalry, is pushing us into a desperate scramble for the markets on more or less equal terms with other nations, because, once more, we have lost that command of them which we once had. Desperate is not too strong a word. We shall let this impulse to snatch markets carry us whither it will, whither it must. Today it is successful burglary and disgrace. Tomorrow it may be mere defeat and disgrace. Now this is not a digression, although in saying this I am nearer to what is generally called politics than I shall be again. I only want to show you what commercial war comes to when it has to do with foreign nations, and that even the dullest can see how mere waste must go with it. That is how we live now with foreign nations, prepared to ruin them without war if possible, with it if necessary, let alone meantime the disgraceful exploiting of savage tribes and barbarous peoples, on whom we force at once our shoddy wares and our hypocrisy at the cannon's mouth. Well, surely socialism can offer you something in the place of all that. It can. It can offer you peace and friendship instead of war. We might live utterly without national rivalries, acknowledging that while it is best for those who feel that they naturally form a community under one name to govern themselves, yet that no community in civilization should feel that it had interests opposed to any other, their economical condition being at any rate similar, so that any citizen of one community could fall to work and live without disturbance of his life when he was in a foreign country, and would fit into his place quite naturally, so that all civilized nations would form one great community, agreeing together as to the kind and amount of production and distribution needed, working at such and such production where it could be best produced, avoiding waste by all means. Please to think of the amount of waste which they would avoid, how much such a revolution would add to the wealth of the world. What creature on earth would be harmed by such a revolution? Nay, would not everybody be the better for it? And what hinders it? I will tell you presently. Meantime, let us pass from this competition between nations to that between the organisers of labour, great firms, joint stock companies, capitalists in short, and see how competition stimulates production among them. Indeed, it does do that, but what kind of production? Well, production of something to sell at a profit, or, say, production of profits. And note how war commercial stimulates that. A certain market is demanding goods. There are, say, 100 manufacturers who make that kind of goods, and every one of them would, if he could, keep that market to himself, and struggles desperately to get as much of it as he can. With the obvious result that presently the thing is overdone, and the market is glutted, and all that fury of manufacture has to sink into cold ashes. Can't you see the waste of it? Waste of labour, skill, cunning. Waste of life, in short. Well, you may say, but it cheapens the goods. In a sense it does, and yet only apparently, as wages have a tendency to sink for the ordinary worker in proportion as prices sink. And at what a cost do we gain this appearance of cheapness? Plainly speaking, at the cost of cheating the consumer and starving the real producer, for the benefit of the gambler who uses both consumer and producer as his milch cows. I needn't go at length into the subject of adulteration, for everyone knows what kind of a part it plays in this sort of commerce. But remember that it is an absolutely necessary incident to the production of profit out of wares, which is the business of the so-called manufacturer. And this you must understand, that, taking him in the lump, the consumer is perfectly helpless against the gambler. The goods are forced on him by their cheapness, and with them a certain kind of life, which that energetic, that aggressive cheapness determines for him. For so far-reaching is this curse of commercial war that no country is safe from its ravages. The traditions of 1,000 years fall before it in a month. It overruns a weak or semi-barbarous country, and whatever romance or pleasure or art existed there is trodden down into a mire of sordidness and ugliness. The Indian or Javanese craftsman may no longer ply his craft leisurely, working a few hours a day, in producing a maze of strange beauty on a piece of cloth. A steam engine is set a-going at Manchester, and that victory over nature and 1,000 stubborn difficulties is used for the base work of producing a sort of plaster of china clay and shoddy. And the Asiatic worker, if he is not starved to death outright, as plentifully happens, is driven himself into a factory to lower the wages of his Manchester brother worker. And nothing of character is left him except, most like, an accumulation of fear and hatred of that, to him most unaccountable evil, his English master. The South Sea Islander must leave his canoe-carving, his sweet rest, and his graceful dances, and become the slave of a slave. Trousers, shoddy, rum, missionary, and fatal disease. He must swallow all this civilization in the lump, and neither himself nor we can help him now, till social order displaces the hideous tyranny of gambling that has ruined him. Let those be types of the consumer, but now for the producer. I mean the real producer, the worker. How does this scramble for the plunder of the market affect him? The manufacturer, in the eagerness of his war, has had to collect into one neighbourhood a vast army of workers. He has drilled them till they are as fit as may be for his special branch of production, that is, for making a profit out of it, and with the result of their being fit for nothing else. Well, when the glut comes in that market he is supplying, what happens to this army, every private in which has been depending on the steady demand in that market, and acting, as he could not choose but act, as if it were to go on forever? You know well what happens to these men. The factory door is shut on them. On a very large part of them, often, and at the best on the reserve army of labour so busily employed in the time of inflation. Nay, we know that well enough just now, but what we don't know, or don't choose to know, is that this reserve army of labour is an absolute necessity for commercial war. If our manufacturers had not got these poor devils whom they could draft onto their machines when the demand swelled, other manufacturers in France or Germany or America would step in and take the market from them. So you see, as we live now, it is necessary that a vast part of the industrial population should be exposed to the danger of periodical semi-starvation. And that, not for the advantage of the people in another part of the world, but for their degradation and enslavement. Just let your minds run for a moment on the kind of waste which this means, this opening up of new markets among savage and barbarous countries, which is the extreme type of the force of the profit market on the world, and you will surely see what a hideous nightmare that profit market is. It keeps us sweating and terrified for our livelihood, unable to read a book or look at a picture, or have pleasant fields to walk in, or to lie in the sun, or to share in the knowledge of our time. To have, in short, either animal or intellectual pleasure. And for what? That we may go on living the same slavish life till we die, in order to provide for a rich man what is called a life of ease and luxury. That is to say, a life so empty, unwholesome, and degraded that perhaps on the whole he is worse off than we the workers are. And as to the result of all this suffering, it is luckiest when it is nothing at all, when you can say that the wares have done nobody any good, for oftenest they have done many people harm, and we have toiled and groaned and died in making poison and destruction for our fellow men. Well, I say all this is war, and the results of war, the war this time not of competing nations, but of competing firms or capitalist units. And it is this war of the firms which hinders the peace between nations, which you have surely agreed with me in thinking is so necessary. For you must know that war is the very breath of the nostrils of these fighting firms, and they have now in our times got into their hands nearly all the political power, and they band together in each country, in order to make their respective governments fulfill just two functions. The first is at home, to act as a strong police force, to keep the ring in which the strong are beating down the weak. The second is to act as a piratical bodyguard abroad, a petard to explode the doors which lead to the markets of the world. Markets at any price abroad? Uninterfered with privilege falsely called laissez-faire at any price at home. To provide these is the sole business of a government such as our industrial captains have been able to conceive of. I must now try to show you the reason of all this and what it rests on by trying to answer the question, why have the profit-makers got all this power? Or at least, why are they able to keep it? That takes us to the third form of war commercial, the last and the one which all the rest is founded on. We have spoken first of the war of rival nations, next of that of rival firms. We have now to speak of rival men. As nations under the present system are driven to compete with one another for the markets of the world, and as firms or the captains of industry have to scramble for their share of the profits of the markets, so also have the workers to compete with each other for livelihood. And it is this constant competition or war amongst them which enables the profit grinders to make their profits, and by means of the wealth so acquired, to take all the executive power of the country into their hands. But here is the difference between the position of the workers and the profit-makers. To the latter, the profit-grinders, war is necessary. You cannot have profit-making without competition, individual, corporate, and national. But you may work for a livelihood without competing. You may combine instead of competing. I have said war was the life-breath of the profit-makers. In like manner, combination is the life of the workers. The working classes, or proletariat, cannot even exist as a class without combination of some sort. The necessity which forced the profit-grinders to collect their men first into workshops, working by the division of labour, and next into great factories worked by machinery, and so gradually to draw them into the great towns and centres of civilization, gave birth to a distinct working class, or proletariat, and this it was which gave them their mechanical existence, so to say. But note that they are indeed combined into social groups for the production of wares, but only as yet mechanically. They do not know what they are working at, nor whom they are working for, because they are combining to produce wares of which the profit of a master forms an essential part, instead of goods for their own use. As long as they do this, and compete with each other for leave to do it, they will be, and will feel themselves to be, simply a part of those competing firms I have been speaking of. They will be, in fact, just a part of the machinery for the production of profit. And so long as this lasts, it will be the aim of the masters or profit-makers to decrease the market value of this human part of their machinery. That is to say, since they already hold in their hands the labour of dead men in the form of capital and machinery, it is their interest, or we will say their necessity, to pay as little as they can help for the labour of living men which they have to buy from day to day. And since the workmen they employ have nothing but their labour power, They are compelled to underbid one another for employment and wages, and so enable the capitalist to play his game. I have said that, as things go, the workers are a part of the competing firms, an adjunct of capital. Nevertheless, they are only so by compulsion, and even without their being conscious of it, they struggle against that compulsion and its immediate results, the lowering of their wages, of their standard of life. And this they do and must do, both as a class and individually. Just as the slave of the great Roman lord, though he distinctly felt himself to be a part of the household, yet collectively was a force in reserve for its destruction, and individually stole from his lord whenever he could safely do so. So here, you see, is another form of war necessary to the way we live now, the war of class against class, which, when it rises to its height, and it seems to be rising at present, will destroy those other forms of war we have been speaking of, will make the position of the profit-makers, of perpetual commercial war, untenable, will destroy the present system of competitive privilege or commercial war. Now observe, I said that to the existence of the workers it was combination, not competition, that was necessary, while to that of the profit-makers combination was impossible and war necessary. The present position of the workers is that of the machinery of commerce, or in plainer words, its slaves. When they change that position and become free, the class of profit-makers must cease to exist. And what will then be the position of the workers? Even as it is, they are the one necessary part of society, the life-giving part. The other classes are but hangers-on who live on them. But what should they be, what will they be, when they once for all come to know their real power, and cease competing with one another for livelihood? I will tell you, they will be society, they will be the community. And being society, that is, there being no class outside them to contend with, they can then regulate their labour in accordance with their own real needs. There is much talk about supply and demand, but the supply and demand usually meant is an artificial one. It is under the sway of the gambling market. The demand is forced, as I hinted above, before it is supplied. Nor, as each producer is working against all the rest, can the producers hold their hands, till the market is glutted and the workers, thrown out on the streets, hear that there has been overproduction, amidst which overplus of unsaleable goods they go ill-supplied with even necessaries, because the wealth which they themselves have created is ill-distributed, as we call it, that is, unjustly taken away from them. When the workers are society, they will regulate their labour, so that the supply and demand shall be genuine, not gambling. The two will then be commensurate, for it is the same society which demands that also supplies. There will be no more artificial famines then, no more poverty amidst overproduction, amidst too great a stock of the very things which should supply poverty and turn it into well-being. In short, there will be no waste and therefore no tyranny. Well now, what socialism offers you in place of these artificial famines with their so-called overproduction is, once more, regulation of the markets. Supply and demand commensurate. No gambling and, consequently, once more, no waste. Not overwork and weariness for the worker one month and the next no work and terror of starvation, but steady work and plenty of leisure every month. Not cheap market wares, that is to say adulterated wares with scarcely any good in them, mere scaffold poles for building up profits. No labour would be spent on such things as these, which people would cease to want when they ceased to be slaves. Not these, but such goods as best fulfil the real uses of the consumers would labour be set to make. For profit being abolished, people could have what they wanted, instead of what the profit grinders, at home and abroad, forced them to take. For what I want you to understand is this, that in every civilized country at least there is plenty for all, is, or at any rate might be. Even with labour so misdirected as it is at present, an equitable distribution of the wealth we have would make all people comparatively comfortable. But that is nothing to the wealth we might have if labour were not misdirected. Observe, in the early days of the history of man, he was the slave of his most immediate necessities. Nature was mighty, and he was feeble, and he had to wage constant war with her for his daily food and such shelter as he could get. His life was bound down and limited by this constant struggle. All his morals, law, religion are in fact the outcome and the reflection of this ceaseless toil of earning his livelihood. Time passed, and little by little, step by step, he grew stronger, till now, after all these ages, he has almost completely conquered nature, and one would think should now have leisure to turn his thoughts towards higher things than procuring tomorrow's dinner. But alas, his progress has been broken and halting, and though he has indeed conquered nature and has her forces under his control to do what he will with, he still has himself to conquer. He still has to think how he will best use those forces which he has mastered. At present he uses them blindly, foolishly, as one driven by mere fate. It would almost seem as if some phantom of the ceaseless pursuit of food which was once the master of the savage was still hunting the civilized man, who toils in a dream, as it were, haunted by mere dim, unreal hopes, born of vague recollections of the days gone by. Out of that dream he must wake, and face things as they really are. The conquest of nature is complete, may we not say? And now our business is, and has for long been, the organization of a man who wields the forces of nature. Nor, till this is attempted at least, shall we ever be free of that terrible phantom of fear of starvation, which, with its brother devil, desire of domination, drives us into injustice, cruelty, and dastardliness of all kinds. To cease to fear our fellows and learn to depend on them, to do away with competition and build up cooperation, is our one necessity. End of section 1. Section 2 of Signs of Change by William Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Deborah Brabin. How We Live and How We Might Live, Part 2. Now, to get closer to details. You probably know that every man in civilization is worth, so to say, more than his skin. Working as he must work socially, he can produce more than will keep himself alive and in fair condition. And this has been so for many centuries, from the time, in fact, when warring tribes began to make their conquered enemies slaves instead of killing them. And of course his capacity of producing these extras has gone on increasing faster and faster, till today one man will weave, for instance, as much cloth in a week as will clothe a whole village for years. And the real question of civilization has always been, what are we to do with this extra produce of labor? A question which the phantom fear of starvation and its fellow desire of domination has driven men to answer pretty badly always, and worst of all perhaps in these present days when the extra produce has grown with such prodigious speed. The practical answer has always been for man to struggle with his fellow for private possession of undue shares of these extras. And all kinds of devices have been employed by those who found themselves in possession of the power of taking them from others, to keep those whom they had robbed in perpetual subjection. And these latter, as I have already hinted, had no chance of resisting this fleecing as long as they were few and scattered, and consequently could have little sense of their common oppression. But now that, owing to the very pursuit of these undue shares of profit or extra earnings, men have become more dependent on each other for production, and have been driven, as I said before, to combine together for that end more completely, the power of the workers, that is to say of the robbed or fleeced class, has enormously increased, and it only remains for them to understand that they have this power. When they do that, they will be able to give the right answer to the question, what is to be done with the extra products of labour, over and above what will keep the labourer alive to labour? Which answer is, that the worker will have all that he produces and not be fleeced at all. And remember that he produces collectively, and therefore he will do effectively what work is required of him according to his capacity, and of the produce of that work he will have what he needs. Because, you see, he cannot use more than he needs, he can only waste it. If this arrangement seems to you preposterously ideal, as well it may looking at our present condition, I must back it up by saying that when men are organized so that their labor is not wasted, they will be relieved from the fear of starvation and the desire of domination, and will have freedom and leisure to look around and see what they really do need. Now something of that I can conceive for my own self, and I will lay my ideas before you so that you may compare them with your own, asking you always to remember that the very differences in men's capacities and desires, after the common need of food and shelter is satisfied, will make it easier to deal with their desires in a communal state of things. What is it that I need, therefore, which my surrounding circumstances can give me, my dealings with my fellow men? setting aside inevitable accidents which cooperation and forethought cannot control, if there be such. Well, first of all, I claim good health. And I say that a vast proportion of people in civilization scarcely even know what that means. To feel mere life a pleasure, to enjoy the moving one's limbs and exercising one's bodily powers, to play, as it were, with sun and wind and rain, to rejoice in satisfying the due bodily appetites of a human animal without fear of degradation or sense of wrongdoing. Yes, and therewithal to be well-formed, straight-limbed, strongly knit, expressive of countenance, to be, in a word, beautiful. That also I claim. If we cannot have this claim satisfied, we are but poor creatures, after all. And I claim it in the teeth of those terrible doctrines of asceticism which, born of the despair of the oppressed and degraded, have been for so many ages used as instruments for the continuance of that oppression and degradation. And I believe that this claim for a healthy body for all of us carries with it all other due claims, for who knows where the seeds of disease, which even rich people suffer from, were first sown? From the luxury of an ancestor, perhaps, yet often, I suspect, from his poverty. And for the poor, a distinguished physicist has said that the poor suffer always from one disease, hunger, and at least I know this, that if a man is overworked in any degree, he cannot enjoy the sort of health I am speaking of, nor can he if he is continually chained to one dull round of mechanical work, with no hope at the other end of it, nor if he lives in continual sordid anxiety for his livelihood, nor if he is ill-housed, nor if he is deprived of all enjoyment of the natural beauty of the world, nor if he has no amusement to quicken the flow of his spirits from time to time. All these things, which touch more or less directly on his bodily condition, are born of the claim I make to live in good health. Indeed, I suspect that these good conditions must have been in force for several generations before a population in general will be really healthy, as I have hinted above. But also I doubt not that in the course of time they would, joined to other conditions of which more hereafter, gradually breed such a population, living in enjoyment of animal life at least, happy therefore, and beautiful according to the beauty of their race. On this point I may note that the very variations in the races of men are caused by the conditions under which they live, and though in these rougher parts of the world we lack some of the advantages of climate and surroundings, yet if we were working for livelihood and not for profit, we might easily neutralize many of the disadvantages of our climate, at least enough to give due scope to the full development of our race. Now the next thing I claim is education. And you must not say that every English child is educated now. That sort of education will not answer my claim, though I cheerfully admit it is something. Something, and yet after all only class education. What I claim is liberal education. Opportunity, that is, to have my share of whatever knowledge there is in the world, according to my capacity or bent of mind, historical or scientific, and also to have my share of skill of hand which is about in the world, either in the industrial handicrafts or in the fine arts, picture painting, sculpture, music, acting, or the like. I claim to be taught, if I can be taught, more than one craft to exercise for the benefit of the community. You may think this is a large claim, but I am clear it is not too large a claim if the community is to have any gain out of my special capacities, if we are not all to be beaten down to a dull level of mediocrity as we are now, all but the very strongest and toughest of us. But also I know that this claim for education involves one for public advantages in the shape of public libraries, schools, and the like, such as no private person, not even the richest, could command. But these I claim very confidently, being sure that no reasonable community could bear to be without such helps to a decent life. Again, the claim for education involves a claim for abundant leisure, which once more I make with confidence, because when once we have shaken off the slavery of profit, labour would be organised so unwastefully that no heavy burden would be laid on the individual citizens, every one of whom, as a matter of course, would have to pay his toll of some obviously useful work. At present you must note that all the amazing machinery which we have invented has served only to increase the amount of profit-bearing wares. In other words, to increase the amount of profit pouched by individuals for their own advantage, part of which profit they use as capital for the production of more profit, with ever the same waste attached to it, and part as private riches or means for luxurious living, which again is sheer waste, is in fact to be looked on as a kind of bonfire. on which rich men burn up the product of the labour they have fleeced from the workers beyond what they themselves can use. So I say that, in spite of our inventions, no worker works under the present system an hour the less on account of those labour-saving machines, so-called. But under a happier state of things they would be used simply for saving labour, with the result of a vast amount of leisure gained for the community, to be added to that gained by the avoidance of the waste of useless luxury and the abolition of the service of commercial war. And I may say that as to that leisure, as I should in no case do any harm to anyone with it, so I should often do some direct good to the community with it, by practicing arts or occupations for my hands or brain which would give pleasure to many of the citizens. In other words, a great deal of the best work done would be done in the leisure time of men relieved from any anxiety as to their livelihood, and eager to exercise their special talent, as all men, nay, all animals are. Now again, this leisure would enable me to please myself and expand my mind by travelling if I had a mind to it. Because say, for instance, that I were a shoemaker. If due social order were established, it by no means follows that I should always be obliged to make shoes in one place. A due amount of easily conceivable arrangement would enable me to make shoes in Rome, say, for 3 months, and to come back with new ideas of building gathered from the sight of the works of past ages, amongst other things which would perhaps be of service in London. But now, in order that my leisure might not degenerate into idleness and aimlessness, I must set up a claim for due work to do. Nothing to my mind is more important than this demand, and I must ask your leave to say something about it. I have mentioned that I should probably use my leisure for doing a great deal of what is now called work. But it is clear that if I am a member of a socialist community, I must do my due share of rougher work than this, my due share of what my capacity enables me to do, that is, no fitting of me to a Procrustean bed. But even that share of work necessary to the existence of the simplest social life must, in the first place, whatever else it is, be reasonable work. That is, it must be such work as a good citizen can see the necessity for. As a member of the community, I must have agreed to do it. To take 2 strong instances of the contrary, I won't submit to be dressed up in red and marched off to shoot at my French or German or Arab friend in a quarrel that I don't understand. I will rebel sooner than do that. Nor will I submit to waste my time and energies in making some trifling toy which I know only a fool can desire. I will rebel sooner than do that. However, you may be sure that in a state of social order I shall have no need to rebel against any such pieces of unreason, only I am forced to speak from the way we live to the way we might live. Again, if the necessary reasonable work be of a mechanical kind, I must be helped to do it by a machine. Not to cheapen my labour, but so that as little time as possible may be spent upon it, and that I may be able to think of other things while I am tending the machine. And if the work be specially rough or exhausting, you will, I am sure, agree with me in saying that I must take turns in doing it with other people. I mean, I mustn't, for instance, be expected to spend my working hours always at the bottom of a coal pit. I think such work as that ought to be largely volunteer work, and done, as I say, in spells. And what I say of very rough work, I say also of nasty work. On the other hand, I should think very little of the manhood of a stout and healthy man who did not feel a pleasure in doing rough work, always supposing him to work under the conditions I have been speaking of, namely, feeling that it was useful and consequently honoured, and that it was not continuous or hopeless, and that he was really doing it of his own free will. The last claim I make for my work is that the places I worked in, factories or workshops, should be pleasant just as the fields where our most necessary work is done are pleasant. Believe me, there is nothing in the world to prevent this being done, save the necessity of making profits on all wares. In other words, the wares are cheapened at the expense of people being forced to work in crowded, unwholesome, squalid, noisy dens. That is to say, they are cheapened at the expense of the workman's life. Well, so much for my claims as to my necessary work, my tribute to the community. I believe people would find, as they advanced in their capacity for carrying on social order, that life so lived was much less expensive than we can now have any idea of, and that after a little people would rather be anxious to seek work than to avoid it, that our working hours would rather be merry parties of men and maids, young men and old, enjoying themselves over their work, than the grumpy weariness it mostly is now. Then would come the time for the new birth of art, so much talked of, so long deferred, People could not help showing their mirth and pleasure in their work, and would be always wishing to express it in a tangible and more or less enduring form, and the workshop would once more be a school of art, whose influence no one could escape from. And again that word art leads me to my last claim, which is that the material surroundings of my life should be pleasant, generous, and beautiful. That I know is a large claim, but this I will say about it, that if it cannot be satisfied, if every civilized community cannot provide such surroundings for all its members, I do not want the world to go on. It is a mere misery that man has ever existed. I do not think it possible under the present circumstances to speak too strongly on this point. I feel sure that the time will come when people will find it difficult to believe that a rich community such as ours, having such command over external nature, could have submitted to live such a mean, shabby, dirty life as we do. And once for all, there is nothing in our circumstances save the hunting of profit that drives us into it. It is profit that draws men into enormous, unmanageable aggregations called towns, for instance. Profit which crowds them up when they are there into quarters without gardens or open spaces. Profit which won't take the most ordinary precautions against wrapping a whole district in a cloud of sulphurous smoke, which turns beautiful rivers into filthy sewers, which condemns all but the rich to live in houses idiotically cramped and confined at the best, and at the worst, in houses for whose wretchedness there is no name. I say it is almost incredible that we should bear such crass stupidity as this, nor should we if we could help it. We shall not bear it when the workers get out of their heads that they are but an appendage to profit grinding, that the more profits that are made, the more employment at high wages there will be for them, and that therefore all the incredible filth, disorder, and degradation of modern civilizations are signs of their prosperity. So far from that, they are signs of their slavery. When they are no longer slaves, they will claim as a matter of course that every man and every family should be generously lodged, that every child should be able to play in a garden close to the place his parents live in, that the houses should, by their obvious decency and order, be ornaments to nature, not disfigurements of it. For the decency and order above mentioned, when carried to the due pitch, would most assuredly lead to beauty in building. All this, of course, would mean the people, that is, all society, duly organized, having in its own hands the means of production to be owned by no individual but used by all as occasion called for its use, and can only be done on those terms. On any other terms, people will be driven to accumulate private wealth for themselves, and thus, as we have seen, to waste the goods of the community and perpetuate the division into classes, which means continual war and waste. As to what extent it may be necessary or desirable for people under social order to live in common, we may differ pretty much according to our tendencies towards social life. For my part, I can't see why we should think it a hardship to eat with the people we work with. I am sure that as to many things, such as valuable books, pictures, and splendour of surroundings, we shall find it better to club our means together. And I must say that often, when I have been sickened by the stupidity of the mean, idiotic rabbit warrens that rich men build for themselves in Bayswater and elsewhere, I console myself with visions of the noble communal hall of the future, unsparing of materials, generous in worthy ornament, alive with the best thoughts of our time and the past embodied in the best art which a free and manly people could produce, such an abode of man as no private enterprise could come anywhere near for beauty and fitness, because only collective thought and collective life could cherish the aspirations which would give birth to its beauty, or have the skill and leisure to carry them out. I, for my part, should think it very much the reverse of a hardship if I had to read my books and meet my friends in such a place. Nor do I think I am better off to live in a vulgar, stuccoed house, crowded with upholstery that I despise, in all respects degrading to the mind and enervating to the body to live in, simply because I call it my own or my house. It is not an original remark, but I make it here, that my home is where I meet people with whom I sympathize, whom I love. Well, that is my opinion as a middle-class man. Whether a working-class man would think his family possession of his wretched little room better than his share of the palace of which I have spoken, I must leave to his opinion and to the imaginations of the middle class. who perhaps may sometimes conceive the fact that the said worker is cramped for space and comfort, say on washing day. Before I leave this matter of the surroundings of life, I wish to meet a possible objection. I have spoken of machinery being used freely for releasing people from the more mechanical and repulsive part of necessary labour. And I know that to some cultivated people, people of the artistic turn of mind, machinery is particularly distasteful. And they will be apt to say you will never get your surroundings pleasant so long as you are surrounded by machinery. I don't quite admit that. It is the allowing machines to be our masters and not our servants that so injures the beauty of life nowadays. In other words, it is the token of the terrible crime we have fallen into, of using our control of nature for the purpose of enslaving people. We, careless meantime of how much happiness we rob their lives of. Yet for the consolation of the artists, I will say that I believe indeed that a state of social order would probably lead at first to a great development of machinery for really useful purposes, because people will still be anxious about getting through the work necessary to holding society together, but that after a while they will find that there is not so much work to do as they expected, and that then they will have leisure to reconsider the whole subject. And if it seems to them that a certain industry would be carried on more pleasantly as regards the worker, and more effectually as regards the goods, by using handwork rather than machinery, they will certainly get rid of their machinery, because it will be possible for them to do so. It isn't possible now. We are not at liberty to do so. We are slaves to the monsters we have created. And I have a kind of hope that the very elaboration of machinery in a society whose purpose is not the multiplication of labour, as it now is, but the carrying on of a pleasant life, as it would be under social order, that the elaboration of machinery, I say, will lead to the simplification of life, and so once more to the limitation of machinery. Well, I will now let my claims for decent life stand as I have made them. To sum them up in brief, they are: first, a healthy body; second, an active mind in sympathy with the past, the present, and the future; thirdly, occupation fit for a healthy body and an active mind; and fourthly, a beautiful world to live in. These are the conditions of life which the refined man of all ages has set before him as the thing above all others to be attained. Too often he has been so foiled in their pursuit that he has turned longing eyes backward to the days before civilization, when man's sole business was getting himself food from day to day, and hope was dormant in him, or at least could not be expressed by him. Indeed, if civilization, as many think, forbids the realization of the hope to attain such conditions of life, then civilization forbids mankind to be happy. And if that be the case, then let us stifle all aspirations towards progress, nay, all feelings of mutual goodwill and affection between men, and snatch, each one of us, what we can from the heap of wealth that fools create for rogues to grow fat on. Or better still, let us as speedily as possible find some means of dying like men, since we are forbidden to live like men. Rather, however, take courage, and believe that we of this age, in spite of all its torment and disorder, have been born to a wonderful heritage, fashioned of the work of those that have gone before us, and that the day of the organization of man is dawning. It is not we who can build up the new social order. The past ages have done the most of that work for us, but we can clear our eyes to the signs of the times, and we shall then see that the attainment of a good condition of life is being made possible for us, and that it is now our business to stretch out our hands to take it. And how? Chiefly, I think, by educating people to a sense of their real capacities as men, so that they may be able to use to their own good the political power which is rapidly being thrust upon them, to get them to see that the old system of organizing labour for individual profit is becoming unmanageable, and that the whole people have now got to choose between the confusion resulting from the break-up of that system and the determination to take in hand the labour now organized for profit, and use its organization for the livelihood of the community. To get people to see that individual profit-makers are not a necessity for labour, but an obstruction to it, and that, not only or chiefly because they are the perpetual pensioners of labour, as they are, but rather because of the waste which their existence as a class necessitates. All this we have to teach people, when we have taught ourselves, and I admit that the work is long and burdensome. As I began by saying, people have been made so timorous of change by the terror of starvation that even the unluckiest of them are stolid and hard to move. Hard as the work is, however, its reward is not doubtful. The mere fact that a body of men, however small, are banded together as socialist missionaries shows that the change is going on. As the working classes, the real organic part of society, take in these ideas, hope will arise in them, and they will claim changes in society, many of which doubtless will not tend directly towards their emancipation, because they will be claimed without due knowledge of the one thing necessary to claim, equality of condition, but which indirectly will help to break up our rotten sham society, while that claim for equality of condition will be made constantly and with growing loudness, till it must be listened to. And then, at last, it will be only a step over the border, and the civilized world will be socialized. And looking back on what has been, we shall be astonished to think of how long we submitted to live as we live now. End of section 2. Section 3 of Signs of Change by William Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Deborah Brabin. Whigs, Democrats and Socialists. What is the state of parties in England today? How shall we enumerate them? The Whigs, who stand first on the list in my title, are considered generally to be the survival of an old historical party once looked on as having democratic tendencies, but now the hope of all who would stand soberly on the ancient ways. Besides these, there are Tories also, the descendants of the stout defenders of church and state and the divine right of kings. Now, I don't mean to say but that, at the back of this ancient name of Tory, there lies a great mass of genuine conservative feeling, held by people who, if they had their own way, would play some rather fantastic tricks, I fancy. Nay, even might, in the course of time, be somewhat rough with such people as are in this hall at present. But this feeling, after all, is only a sentiment now. All practical hope has died out of it, and these worthy people cannot have their own way. It is true that they elect members of Parliament who talk very big to please them, and sometimes even they manage to get a government into power that nominally represents their sentiment. But when that happens, the said government is forced, even when its party has a majority in the House of Commons, to take a much lower standpoint than the high Tory ideal. The utmost that the real Tory party can do, even when backed by the Primrose League and its sham hierarchy, is to delude the electors to return Tories to Parliament to pass measures more akin to radicalism than the Whigs durst attempt, so that, though there are Tories, there is no Tory party in England. On the other hand, there is a party, which I can call for the present by no other name than Whig, which is both numerous and very powerful, and which does in fact govern England, and to my mind will always do so as long as the present constitutional parliament lasts. Of course, like all parties, it includes men of various shades of opinion, from the Tory-tinted Whiggery of Lord Salisbury to the radical-tinted Whiggery of Mr. Chamberlain's present tale. Neither do I mean to say that they are conscious of being a united party. On the contrary, the groups will sometimes oppose each other furiously at elections, and perhaps the more simple-minded of them really think that it is a matter of importance to the nation which section of them may be in power. But they may always be reckoned upon to be in their places and vote against any measure which carries with it a real attack on our constitutional system. Surely very naturally, since they are there for no other purpose than to do so. They are, and always must be, conscious defenders of the present system, political and economical, as long as they have any cohesion as Tories, Whigs, Liberals, or even Radicals. Not one of them probably would go such a very short journey towards revolution as the abolition of the House of Lords. A one-chamber parliament would seem to them an impious horror, and the abolition of the monarchy they would consider a serious inconvenience to the London tradesman. Now this is the real parliamentary party, at present divided into jarring sections under the influence of the survival of the party warfare of the last few generations, but which already shows signs of sinking its differences so as to offer a solid front of resistance to the growing instinct, which on its side will before long result in a party claiming full economical as well as political freedom for the whole people. But is there nothing in Parliament, or seeking entrance to it, except this variously tinted Whiggery, this harlequin of reaction? Well, inside Parliament, setting aside the Irish party, which is, we may now well hope, merely temporarily there is not much. It is not among people of wealth and local influence, who I see are supposed to be the only available candidates for Parliament of a recognized party, that you will find the elements of revolution. We will grant that there are some few genuine Democrats there, and let them pass. But outside there are undoubtedly many who are genuine Democrats, and who have it in their heads that it is both possible and desirable to capture the constitutional parliament and turn it into a real popular assembly, which with the people behind it might lead us peaceably and constitutionally into the great revolution which all thoughtful men desire to bring about. All thoughtful men, that is, who do not belong to the consciously cynical Tories, i.e., men determined, whether it be just or unjust, good for humanity or bad for it, to keep the people down as long as they can, which they hope very naturally will be as long as they live. To capture Parliament and turn it into a popular but constitutional assembly is, I must conclude, the aspiration of the genuine Democrats wherever they may be found. That is their idea of the first step of the democratic policy. The questions to be asked of this, as of all other policies, are, first, what is the end proposed by it? And secondly, are they likely to succeed? As to the end proposed, I think there is much difference of opinion. Some Democrats would answer from the merely political point of view and say, universal suffrage, payment of members, annual parliaments, abolition of the House of Lords, abolition of the monarchy, and so forth. I would answer this by saying, after all, these are not ends, but means to an end, and passing by the fact that the last two are not constitutional measures, and so could not be brought about without actual rebellion, I would say if you had gained all these things and more, all you would have done would have been to establish the ascendancy of the Democratic Party. Having so established it, you would then have to find out by the usual party means what that Democratic Party meant, and you would find that your triumph in mere politics would lead you back again exactly to the place you started from. You would be Whigs under a different name. Monarchy, House of Lords, pensions, standing army, and the rest of it are only supports to the present social system, the privilege based on the wages and capital system of production, and are worth nothing except as supports to it. If you are determined to support that system, therefore, you had better leave these things alone. The real masters of society, the real tyrants of the people, are the landlords and capitalists whom your political triumph would not interfere with. Then as now there would be a proletariat and a moneyed class. Then as now it would be possible, sometimes, for a diligent, energetic man with his mind set wholly on such success, to climb out of the proletariat into the moneyed class, there to sweat as he once was sweated. Which, my friends, is, if you will excuse the word, your ridiculous idea of freedom of contract. The sole and utmost success of your policy would be that it might raise up a strong opposition to the condition of things which it would be your function to uphold. But most probably such opposition would still be outside Parliament and not in it. You would have made a revolution, probably not without bloodshed, only to show people the necessity for another revolution the very next day. Will you think the example of America too trite? Anyhow, consider it. A country with universal suffrage, no king, no House of Lords, no privilege, as you fondly think, only a little standing army chiefly used for the murder of redskins, a democracy after your model, and with all that a society corrupt to the core and at this moment engaged in suppressing freedom, with just the same reckless brutality and blind ignorance as the Tsar of all the Russias uses. But it will be said, and certainly with much truth, that not all the Democrats are for mere political reform. I say that I believe that this is true, and it is a very important truth too. I will go farther, and will say that all those Democrats who can be distinguished from Whigs do intend social reforms, which they hope will somewhat alter the relations of the classes towards each other. And there is, generally speaking, amongst Democrats a leaning towards a kind of limited state socialism. And it is through that they hope to bring about a peaceful revolution which, if it does not introduce a condition of equality, will at least make the workers better off and contented with their lot. They hope to get a body of representatives elected to Parliament, and by them to get measure after measure passed which will tend towards this goal. Nor would some of them, perhaps most of them, be discontented if by this means we could glide into complete state socialism. I think that the present Democrats are widely tinged with this idea, and to me it is a matter of hope that it is so. Whatever of error there is in it, it means advance beyond the complete barrenness of the mere political programme. Yet I must point out to these semi-socialist Democrats that in the first place they will be made the cat's paw of some of the wilier of the Whigs. There are several of these measures which look to some socialistic, as for instance the allotment scheme, and other schemes tending towards peasant proprietorship, co-operation, and the like, but which after all, in spite of their benevolent appearance, are really weapons in the hands of reactionaries, having for their real object the creation of a new middle class, made out of the working class and at their expense. The raising, in short, of a new army against the attack of the disinherited. There is no end to this kind of dodge, nor will be apparently till there is an end of the class that tries it on, and a great many of the Democrats will be amused and absorbed by it from time to time. They call this sort of nonsense practical. It seems like doing something, while the steady propaganda of a principle which must prevail in the end is, according to them, doing nothing, and is unpractical. For the rest, it is not likely to become dangerous, further than as it clogs the wheels of the real movement somewhat, because it is sometimes a mere piece of reaction, as when, for instance, it takes the form of peasant proprietorship, flying right in the face of the commercial development of the day, which tends ever more and more towards the aggregation of capital, thereby smoothing the way for the organized possession of the means of production by the workers when the true revolution shall come. While, on the other hand, when this attempt to manufacture a new middle class takes the form of cooperation and the like, it is not dangerous because it means nothing more than a slightly altered form of joint stockery, and everybody almost is beginning to see this. The greed of men, stimulated by the spectacle of profit-making all around them, and also by the burden of the interest on the money which they have been obliged to borrow, will not allow them even to approach a true system of cooperation. Those benefited by the transaction presently become eager shareholders in a commercial speculation, and if they are working men, as they often are, they are also capitalists. The enormous commercial success of the great cooperative societies and the absolute no effect of that success on the social conditions of the workers are sufficient tokens of what this non-political cooperation must come to. Nothing. It shall not be less. But again it may be said, some of the Democrats go farther than this. They take up actual pieces of socialism and are more than inclined to support them. Nationalization of the land or of railways, or cumulative taxation on incomes, or limiting the right of inheritance, or new factory laws, or the restriction by law of the day's labor. One of these, or more than one sometimes, the Democrats will support, and see absolute salvation in these one or two planks of the platform. All this I admit, and once again say it is a hopeful sign, and yet once again I say there is a snare in it. A snake lies lurking in the grass. Those who think that they can deal with our present system in this piecemeal way very much underrate the strength of the tremendous organization under which we live, and which appoints to each of us his place, and if we do not chance to fit it, grinds us down till we do. Nothing but a tremendous force can deal with this force. It will not suffer itself to be dismembered, nor to lose anything which really is its essence, without putting forth all its force in resistance. Rather than lose anything which it considers of importance, it will pull the roof of the world down upon its head. For indeed I grant these semi-socialist Democrats that there is one hope for their tampering piecemeal with our society. If by chance they can excite people into seriously, however blindly, claiming one or other of these things in question, and could be successful in Parliament in driving it through, they would certainly draw on a great civil war, and such a war, once let loose, would not end but either with the full triumph of socialism or its extinction for the present. It would be impossible to limit the aim of the struggle, nor could we even guess at the course which it would take, except that it could not be a matter of compromise. But suppose the Democratic Party peaceably successful on this new basis of semi-state socialism. What would it all mean? Attempts to balance the two classes whose interests are opposed to each other, a mere ignoring of this antagonism which has led us through so many centuries to where we are now, and then, after a period of disappointment and disaster, the naked conflict once more. A revolution made, and another immediately necessary on its morrow. Yet, indeed, it will not come to that, for whatever may be the aims of the Democrats, they will not succeed in getting themselves into a position from whence they could make the attempt to realize them. I have said there are Tories and yet no real Tory party. So also it seems to me that there are Democrats but no Democratic party. At present they are used by the leaders of the parliamentary factions, and also kept at a distance by them from any real power. If they by hook or crook managed to get a number of members into Parliament, they would find out their differences very speedily under the influence of party rule. In point of fact, the Democrats are not a party, because they have no principles other than the old Whig radical ones, extended in some cases so as to take in a little semi-socialism, which the march of events has forced on them. That is, they gravitate on one side to the Whigs and on the other to the Socialists. Whenever, if ever, they begin to be a power in the elections and get members in the House, the temptation to be members of a real live party which may have the government of the country in its hands, the temptation to what is, facetiously I suppose, called practical politics, will be too much for many, even of those who gravitate towards socialism. A quasi-democratic parliamentary party, therefore, would probably be merely a recruiting ground, a nursery for the left wing of the Whigs, though it would indeed leave behind some small nucleus of opposition, the principles of which, however, would be vague and floating, so that it would be but a powerless group after all. The future of the constitutional parliament, therefore, it seems to me, is a perpetual Whig rump, which will yield to pressure when mere political reforms are attempted to be got out of it, but will be quite immovable towards any real change in social and economical matters. That is to say, so far as it may be conscious of the attack, for I grant that it may be betrayed into passing semi-state socialistic measures which will do this amount of good, that they will help to entangle commerce in difficulties, and so add to discontent by creating suffering of which the people will not understand the causes definitely, but which their instinct will tell them truly is brought about by government. And that, too, the only kind of government which they can have so long as the constitutional parliament lasts. Now, if you think I have exaggerated the power of the Whigs, that is, of solid, dead, unmoving resistance to progress, I must call your attention to the events of the last few weeks. Here has been a measure of pacification proposed. At the least and worst, an attempt to enter upon a pacification of a weary and miserable quarrel many centuries old. The British people, in spite of their hereditary prejudice against the Irish, were not averse to the measure. The Tories were as usual powerless against it, yet so strong has been the vis inertiae of Whiggery that it has won a notable victory over common sense and sentiment combined, and has drawn over to it a section of those hitherto known as radicals, and probably would have drawn all radicals over but for the personal ascendancy of Mr. Gladstone. The Whigs, seeing if but dimly that this Irish independence meant an attack on property, have been successful in snatching the promised peace out of the people's hands, and in preparing all kinds of entanglement and confusion for us for a long while, in their steady resistance to even the beginnings of revolution. This, therefore, is what Parliament looks to me. A solid central party, with mere nebulous opposition on the right hand and on the left. The people governed. That is to say, fair play amongst themselves for the money-privileged classes to make the most of their privilege, and to fight sturdily with each other in doing so. But the government concealed as much as possible and also as long as possible. That is to say, the government resting on an assumed necessary eternity of privilege to monopolize the means of the fructification of labour. For so long as that assumption is accepted by the ignorance of the people, the great Whig rump will remain inexpugnable. But as soon as the people's eyes are opened even partially, and they begin to understand the meaning of the words the emancipation of labour, we shall begin to have an assured hope of throwing off the basest and most sordid tyranny which the world has yet seen, the tyranny of so-called constitutionalism. How, then, are the people's eyes to be opened? By the force evolved from the final triumph and consequent corruption of commercial Whiggery, which force will include in it a recognition of its constructive activity by intelligent people on the one hand, and on the other, half-blind instinctive struggles to use its destructive activity on the part of those who suffer and have not been allowed to think, and, to boot, a great deal that goes between those two extremes. In this turmoil, all those who can be truly called socialists will be involved. The modern development of the great class struggle has forced us to think, our thoughts force us to speak, and our hopes force us to try to get a hearing from the people. Nor can one tell how far our words will carry, so to say. The most moderate exposition of our principles will bear with it the seeds of disruption, nor can we tell what form that disruption will take. One and all, then, we are responsible for the enunciation of socialist principles and of the consequences which may flow from their general acceptance, whatever that may be. This responsibility no socialist can shake off by declarations against physical force and in favour of constitutional methods of agitation. We are attacking the Constitution with the very beginnings, the mere lispings of socialism. Whiggery, therefore, in its various forms, is the representative of constitutionalism, is the outward expression of monopoly and consequent artificial restraints on labour and life. And there is only one expression of the force which will destroy Whiggery, and that is socialism. And on the right hand and on the left, Toryism and radicalism will melt into Whiggery, are doing so now. And socialism has got to absorb all that is not Whig in radicalism. Then comes the question, what is the policy of socialism? If Toryism and democracy are only nebulous masses of opposition to the solid centre of Whiggery, what can we call socialism? Well, at present, in England at least, socialism is not a party but a sect. That is sometimes brought against it as a taunt, but I am not dismayed by it, for I can conceive of a sect, nay, I have heard of one, becoming a very formidable power, and becoming so by dint of its long remaining a sect. So I think it is quite possible that socialism will remain a sect till the very eve of the last stroke that completes the revolution, after which it will melt into the new society. And is it not sects, bodies of definite uncompromising principles, that lead us into revolutions? Was it not so in the Cromwellian times? Nay, have not the Fenian sect even in our own days made home rule possible? They may give birth to parties, though not parties themselves. And what should a sect, like we are, have to do in the parliamentary struggle? We, who have an ideal to keep always before ourselves and others, and who cannot accept compromise, who can see nothing that can give us rest for a minute save the emancipation of labour, which will be brought about by the workers gaining possession of all the means of the fructification of labour, and who, even when that is gained, shall have pure communism ahead to strive for. What are we to do, then? Stand by and look on? Not exactly, yet we may look on other people doing their work while we do ours. They are already beginning, as I have said, to stumble about with attempts at state socialism. Let them make their experiments and blunders and prepare the way for us by so doing. And our own business? Well, we, sect or party or group of self-seekers, madmen and poets, which you will, are at least the only set of people who have been able to see that there is and has been a great class struggle going on. Further, we can see that this class struggle cannot come to an end till the classes themselves do. One class must absorb the other. Which, then? Surely the useful one, the one that the world lives by and on. The business of the people at present is to make it impossible for the useless, non-producing class to live, while the business of constitutionalism is, on the contrary, to make it possible for them to live. And our business is to help make the people conscious of this great antagonism between the people and constitutionalism, and meantime to let constitutionalism go on with its government, unhelped by us at least, until it at last becomes conscious of its burden of the people's hate, of the people's knowledge that it is disinherited, which we shall have done our best to further by any means that we could. As to socialists in Parliament, there are two words about that. If they go there to take a part in carrying on constitutionalism, by palliating the evils of the system and so helping our rulers to bear their burden of government, I for one, and so far as their action therein goes, cannot call them socialists at all. But if they go there with the intention of doing what they can towards the disruption of Parliament, that is a matter of tactics for the time being. But even here I cannot help seeing the danger of their being seduced from their true errand, and I fear that they might become, on the terms above mentioned, simply supporters of the very thing they set out to undo. I say that our work lies quite outside Parliament, and it is to help to educate the people by every and any means that may be effective. And the knowledge we have to help them to is threefold: to know their own, to know how to take their own, and to know how to use their own. End of section 3. Section 4 of Signs of Change by William Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Deborah Brabin. Feudal England. It is true that the Norman conquest found a certain kind of feudality in existence in England, a feudality which was developed from the customs of the Teutonic tribes, with no admixture of Roman law. And also that even before the conquest, This country was slowly beginning to be mixed up with the affairs of the continent of Europe, and that not only with the kindred nations of Scandinavia, but with the Romanized countries also. But the conquest of Duke William did introduce the complete feudal system into the country, and it also connected it by strong bonds to the Romanized countries, and yet by doing so laid the first foundations of national feeling in England. The English felt their kinship with the Norsemen or the Danes, and did not suffer from their conquests when they had become complete, and when consequently mere immediate violence had disappeared from them. Their feeling was tribal rather than national. But they could have no sense of tribal unity with the varied populations of the provinces which mere dynastical events had strung together into the dominion, the manor, one may say, of the foreign princes of Normandy and Anjou. And as the kings who ruled them gradually got pushed out of their French possessions, England began to struggle against the domination of men felt to be foreigners, and so gradually became conscious of her separate nationality, though still only in a fashion, as the manner of an English lord. It is beyond the scope of this piece to give anything like a connected story, even of the slightest, of the course of events between the conquest of Duke William and the fully developed medieval period of the 14th century, which is the England that I have before my eyes as medieval or feudal. That period of the 14th century united the developments of the elements which had been stirring in Europe since the final fall of the Roman Empire, and England shared in the general feeling and spirit of the age. Although, from its position, the course of its history and to a certain extent the lives of its people were different. It is to this period, therefore, that I wish in the long run to call your attention, and I will only say so much about the earlier period as may be necessary to explain how the people of England got into the position in which they were found by the Statute of Labourers enacted by Edward III, and the Peasants' Rebellion in the time of his grandson and successor, Richard II. Undoubtedly, then, the Norman conquest made a complete break in the continuity of the history of England. When the Londoners, after the Battle of Hastings, accepted Duke William for their king, no doubt they thought of him as occupying much the same position as that of the newly slain Harold, or at any rate they looked on him as being such a king of England as Canute the Dane, who had also conquered the country. And probably William himself thought no otherwise. But the event was quite different, for on the one hand not only was he a man of strong character, able, masterful, and a great soldier in the modern sense of the word, but he had at his back his wealthy dukedom of Normandy, which he had himself reduced to obedience and organized. And on the other hand, England lay before him, unorganized yet stubbornly rebellious to him, its very disorganization and want of a centre making it more difficult to deal with by merely overrunning it with an army levied for that purpose and backed by a body of housecarls or guards, which would have been the method of a Scandinavian or native king in dealing with his rebellious subjects. Duke William's necessities and instincts combined led him into a very different course of action, which determined the future destiny of the country. What he did was to quarter upon England an army of feudal vassals drawn from his obedient dukedom, and to hand over to them the lordship of the land of England in return for their military service to him, the suzerain of them all. Thenceforward it was under the rule of these foreign landlords that the people of England had to develop. The development of the country as a Teutonic people was checked and turned aside by this event. Duke William brought, in fact, his Normandy into England, which was thereby changed from a Teutonic people, Old Norse theod, with the tribal customary law still in use among them, into a province of Romanized feudal Europe, a piece of France, in short. And though in time she did grow into another England again, she missed forever in her laws, and still more in her language and her literature, the chance of developing into a great homogeneous Teutonic people infused usefully with a mixture of Celtic blood. However, this step which Duke William was forced to take further influenced the future of the country by creating the great order of the baronage, and the history of the early period of England is pretty much that of the struggle of the king with the baronage and the church. For William fixed the type of the successful English medieval king, of whom Henry II and Edward I were the most notable examples afterwards. It was in fact with him that the struggle towards monarchical bureaucracy began, which was checked by the barons who extorted Magna Charta from King John, and afterwards by the revolt headed by Simon de Montfort in Henry III's reign, was carried on vigorously by Edward I, and finally successfully finished by Henry VII, after the long faction fight of the Wars of the Roses had weakened the feudal lords so much that they could no longer assert themselves against the monarchy. As to the other political struggle of the Middle Ages, the contest between the Crown and the Church, two things are to be noted. First, that at least in the earlier period, the Church was on the popular side. Thomas Becket was canonized, it is true, formally and by regular decree, but his memory was held so dear by the people that he would probably have been canonized informally by them if the Holy See at Rome had refused to do so. The second thing to be noted about the dispute is this, that it was no contest of principle. According to the medieval theory of life and religion, the Church and the State were one, in essence, and but separate manifestations of the kingdom of God upon earth, which was part of the kingdom of God in heaven. The king was an officer of that realm and a liege man of God. The doctor of laws and the doctor of physic partook, in a degree, of the priestly character. On the other hand, the Church was not withdrawn from the everyday life of men. The division into a worldly and spiritual life, neither of which had much to do with the other, was a creation of the Protestantism of the Reformation, and had no place in the practice, at least, of the medieval Church, which we cannot too carefully remember is little more represented by modern Catholicism than by modern Protestantism. The contest, therefore, between the Crown and the Church was a mere bickering between two bodies, without any essential antagonism between them, as to how far the administration of either reached. Neither dreamed of subordinating one to the other, far less of extinguishing one by the other. The history of the Crusades, by the way, illustrates very emphatically this position of the Church in the Middle Ages. The foundation of that strange feudal kingdom of Jerusalem, whose very coat of arms was a solecism in heraldry, whose king had precedence in virtue of his place as lord of the centre of Christianity over all other kings and princes. The orders of men-at-arms vowed to poverty and chastity, like the Templars and Knights of St. John, and above all the unquestioning sense of duty that urged men of all classes and kinds into the holy war, show how strongly the idea of God's kingdom on the earth had taken hold of all men's minds in the early Middle Ages. As to the result of the Crusades, they certainly had their influence on the solidification of Europe and the great feudal system, at the head of which, in theory at least, were the Pope and the Kaiser. For the rest, the intercourse with the East gave Europe an opportunity of sharing in the mechanical civilization of the peoples originally dominated by the Arabs and infused by the art of Byzantium and Persia, not without some tincture of the cultivation of the later classical period. The stir and movement also of the Crusades, and the necessities in which they involved the princes and their barons, furthered the upward movement of the classes that lay below the feudal vassals, great and little. The principal opportunity for which movement, however, in England, was given by the continuous struggle between the Crown and the Church and baronage. The early Norman kings, even immediately after the death of the Conqueror, found themselves involved in this struggle and were forced to avail themselves of the help of what had now become the inferior tribe, the native English to wit. Henry I, an able and ambitious man, understood this so clearly that he made a distinct bid for the favour of the inferior tribe by marrying an English princess. And it was by means of the help of his English subjects that he conquered his Norman subjects, and the field of Transpray, which put the coping stone on his success, was felt by the English people as an English victory over the oppressing tribe with which Duke William had overwhelmed the English people. It was during this king's reign and under these influences that the trading and industrial classes began to rise somewhat. The merchant guilds were now in their period of greatest power, and had but just begun, in England at least, to develop into the corporations of the towns. But the towns themselves were beginning to gain their freedom, and to become an important element in the society of the time, as little by little they asserted themselves against the arbitrary rule of the feudal lords, lay or ecclesiastical. For as to the latter, it must be remembered that the Church included in herself the orders or classes into which lay society was divided, and while by its lower clergy of the parishes and by the friars it touched the people, its upper clergy was simply feudal lords. And as the religious fervour of the higher clergy, which was marked enough in the earlier period of the Middle Ages, in Anselm for example, faded out, they became more and more mere landlords. Although from the conditions of their landlordism, living as they did on their land and amidst of their tenants, they were less oppressive than the lay landlords. The order and progress of Henry I's reign, which marks the transition from the mere military camp of the Conqueror to the medieval England I have to dwell upon, was followed by the period of mere confusion and misery which accompanied the accession of the princes of Anjou to the throne of England. In this period the barons widely became mere violent and illegal robbers, and the castles with which the land was dotted, and which were begun under the auspices of the conqueror as military posts, became mere dens of strong thieves. No doubt this made the business of the next able king, Henry II, the easier. He was a staunch man of business, and turned himself with his whole soul towards the establishment of order and the consolidation of the monarchy, which accordingly took a great stride under him towards its ultimate goal of bureaucracy. He would probably have carried the business still farther, since in his contest with the Church, in spite of the canonization of Becket and the king's formal penance at his tomb, he had in fact gained a victory for the crown which it never really lost again. But in his days England was only a part of the vast dominion of his house, which included more than half of France, and his struggle with his feudatories and the French king, which sowed the seed of the loss of that dominion to the English crown, took up much of his life and finally beat him. His two immediate successors, Richard I and John, were good specimens of the chiefs of their line, almost all of whom were very able men, having even a touch of genius in them. But therewithal were such wanton blackguards and scoundrels that one is almost forced to apply the theological word wickedness to them. Such characters belong specially to their times, fertile as they were both of great qualities and of scoundrelism, and in which our own special vice of hypocrisy was entirely lacking. John, the second of these two pests, put the coping stone on the villainy of his family and lost his French dominion in the lump. Under such rascals as these came the turn of the baronage, and they, led by Stephen Langton, the archbishop who had been thrust on the unwilling king by the Pope, united together and forced from him his assent to Magna Charta, the great, thoroughly well-considered deed which is conventionally called the foundation of English liberty, but which can only claim to be so on the ground that it was the confirmation and seal of the complete feudal system in England, and put the relations between the vassals, the great feudatories, and the king on a stable basis, since it created, or at least confirmed, order among these privileged classes, among whom indeed it recognized the towns to a certain extent as part of the great feudal hierarchy, so that even by this time they had begun to acquire status in that hierarchy. So John passed away, and became not long after an almost mythical personage, the type of the bad king. There are still ballads, and prose stories deduced from those ballads, in existence, which tell the tale of this strange monster as the English people imagined it. As they belong to the literature of the 14th century, the period I have undertaken to tell you about specially, I will give you one of the latter of these concerning the death of King John, for whom the people imagined a more dramatic cause of death than mere indigestion, of which in all probability he really died, and you may take it for a specimen of popular literature of the 14th century. I can here make bold to quote from memory, without departing very widely from the old text, since the quaint wording of the original and the spirit of bold and blunt heroism which it breathes have fixed it in my mind forever. The king, you must remember, had halted at Swineshead Abbey in Lincolnshire, in his retreat from the hostile barons and their French allies, and had lost all his baggage by the surprise of the advancing tide in the Wash, so that he might well be in a somewhat sour mood. Says the tale, so the king went to meat in the hall, and before him was a loaf, and he looked grimly on it and said, "For how much is such a loaf sold in this realm?" "Sir, for 1 penny," said they. Then the king smote the board with his fist and said, "By God, if I live for 1 year, such a loaf shall be sold for 12 pence." That heard one of the monks who stood thereby, and he thought and considered that his hour and time to die was come, and that it would be a good deed to slay so cruel a king and so evil a lord. So he went into the garden and plucked plums, and took out of them the steels, stalks, and did venom in them each one. And he came before the king and sat on his knee and said, "Sir, by St. Austin, this is fruit of our garden." Then the king looked evilly on him and said, "Assay them, monk." So the monk took and ate thereof, nor changed countenance any whit, and the king ate thereafter. But presently afterwards the monk swelled and turned blue, and fell down and died before the king. Then waxed the king sick at heart, and he also swelled and died, and so he ended his days. For a while after the death of John and the accession of Henry III, the baronage, strengthened by the Great Charter and with a weak and wayward king on the throne, made their step forward in power and popularity, and the first serious check to the tendency to monarchical bureaucracy, a kind of elementary aristocratic constitution, was imposed upon the weakness of Henry III. Under this movement of the barons, who in their turn had to seek for the support of the people, the towns made a fresh step in advance, and Simon de Montfort, the leader of what, for want of a better word, must be called the popular party, was forced by his circumstances to summon to his parliament citizens from the boroughs. Earl Simon was one of those men that come to the front in violent times, and he added real nobility of character to strength of will and persistence. He became the hero of the people, who went near to canonizing him after his death. But the monarchy was too strong for him and his really advanced projects, which by no means squared with the hopes of the baronage in general. And when Prince Edward, afterwards Edward I, grown to his full mental stature, came to the help of the crown with his unscrupulous business ability, the struggle was soon over. And with Evesham Field the monarchy began to take a new stride, and the longest yet taken, towards bureaucracy. Edward I is remembered by us chiefly for the struggle he carried on with the Scotch baronage for the feudal suzerainty of that kingdom, and the centuries of animosity between the two countries which that struggle drew on. But he has other claims to our attention besides this. At first, and remembering the ruthlessness of many of his acts, especially in the Scotch War, one is apt to look upon him as a somewhat pedantic tyrant and a good soldier, with something like a dash of hypocrisy beyond his time added. But like the Angevin kings I was speaking of just now, he was a completely characteristic product of his time. He was not a hypocrite, probably, after all, in spite of his tears shed after he had irretrievably lost a game, or after he had won one by stern cruelty. There was a dash of real romance in him, which mingled curiously with his lawyer-like qualities. He was perhaps the man of all men who represented most completely the finished feudal system, and who took it most to heart. His law, his romance, and his religion, his self-command, and his terrible fury were all a part of this innate feudalism, and exercised within its limits. And we must suppose that he thoroughly felt his responsibility as the chief of his feudatories, while at the same time he had no idea of his having any responsibilities towards the lower part of his subjects. Such a man was specially suited to carrying on the tendency to bureaucratic centralization which culminated in the Tudor monarchy. He had his struggle with the baronage, but hard as it was, he was sure not to carry it beyond the due limits of feudalism. To that he was always loyal. He had slain Earl Simon before he was king, while he was but his father's general. But Earl Simon's work did not die with him, and henceforward, while the Middle Ages and their feudal hierarchy lasted, it was impossible for either king or barons to do anything which would seriously injure each other's position. The struggle ended in his reign in a balance of power in England which, on the one hand, prevented any great feudatory becoming a rival of the king, as happened in several instances in France, and on the other hand prevented the king lapsing into a mere despotic monarch. I have said that bureaucracy took a great stride in Edward's reign, but it reached its limits under feudalism as far as the nobles were concerned. Peace and order was established between the different powers of the governing classes. Henceforward the struggle is between them and the governed. That struggle was now to become obvious. The lower tribe was rising in importance. It was becoming richer for fleecing, but it was also beginning to have some power. This led the king first, and afterwards the barons, to attack it definitely. It was rich enough to pay for the trouble of being robbed, and not yet strong enough to defend itself with open success, although the slower and less showy success of growth did not fail it. The instrument of attack in the hands of the barons was the ordinary feudal privilege, the logical carrying out of serfdom. But this attack took place 2 reigns later. We shall come to that further on. The attack on the lower tribe, which was now growing into importance, was in this reign made by the king, and his instrument was Parliament. I have told you that Simon de Montfort made some attempt to get the burgesses to sit in his Parliament, but it was left to Edward I to lay the foundations firmly of parliamentary representation, which he used for the purpose of augmenting the power of the crown and crushing the rising liberty of the towns, though of course his direct aim was simply at money. The great council of the realm was purely feudal. It was composed of the feudatories of the king, theoretically of all of them, practically of the great ones only. It was in fact the council of the conquering tribe, with their chief at its head. The matters of the due feudal tribute, aids, reliefs, fines, scutage, and the like, in short, the king's revenue due from his men, were settled in this council at once and in the lump. But the inferior tribe, though not represented there, existed and, as aforesaid, was growing rich. And the king had to get their money out of their purses directly, which, as they were not represented at the council, he had to do by means of his officers, the sheriffs, dealing with them one after another, which was a troublesome job. For the men were stiff-necked and quite disinclined to part with their money, and the robbery having to be done on the spot, so to say, encountered all sorts of opposition. And in fact it was the money needs both of baron, bishop and king which had been the chief instrument in furthering the progress of the towns. The towns would be pressed by their lords, king or baron or bishop as it might be, and they would see their advantage and strike a bargain. For you are not to imagine that because there was a deal of violence going on in those times there was no respect for law. On the contrary, there was a quite exaggerated respect for it if it came within the four corners of the feudal feeling. And the result of this feeling of respect was the constant struggle for status on the part of the townships and other associations throughout the Middle Ages. Well, the burghers would say, 'tis hard to pay this money, but we will put ourselves out to pay it if you will do something for us in return. Let, for example, our men be tried in our own court, and the verdict be of one of compurgation instead of wager of battle. And so forth and so forth. All this sort of detailed bargaining was in fact a safeguard for the local liberties, so far as they went, of the towns and shires, and did not suit the king's views of law and order at all. And so began the custom of the sheriff, the king's officer who had taken the place of the earl of the Anglo-Saxon period, summoning the burgesses to the council. Which burgesses, you must understand, were not elected at the folk-moots of the town or hundred, but in a sort of hole-and-corner way by a few of the bigger men of the place. What the king practically said was this: I want your money, and I cannot be forever wrangling with you stubborn churls at home there, and listening to all your stories of how poor you are and what you want. No, I want you to be represented. Send me up from each one of your communes a man or two whom I can bully, or cajole, or bribe to sign away your substance for you. Under these circumstances it is no wonder that the towns were not very eager in the cause of representation. It was no easy job to get them to come up to London merely to consult as to the kind of sauce with which they were to be eaten. However, they did come in some numbers, and by the year 1295 something like a shadow of our present Parliament was on foot. Nor need there be much more said about this institution. As time went on, its functions got gradually extended by the petition for the redress of grievances accompanying the granting of money, but it was generally to be reckoned on as subservient to the will of the king, who down to the later Tudor period played some very queer tunes on this constitutional instrument. Edward I gave place to his son, who again was of the type of king who had hitherto given the opportunity to the barons for their turn of advancement in the constitutional struggle, and in earlier times no doubt they would have taken full advantage of the circumstances. As it was, they had little to gain. The king did his best to throw off the restraint of the feudal constitution and to govern simply as an absolute monarch. After a time of apparent success he failed, of course, and only succeeded in confirming the legal rights of feudalism by bringing about his own formal deposition at the hands of the baronage, as a chief who, having broken the compact with his feudatories, had necessarily forfeited his right. If we compare his case with that of Charles I, we shall find this difference in it, besides the obvious one that Edward was held responsible to his feudatories and Charles towards the upper middle classes, the squirearchy, as represented by Parliament. That Charles was condemned by a law created for the purpose, so to say, and evolved from the principle of the representation of the propertied classes, while Edward's deposition was the real logical outcome of the confirmed feudal system and was practically legal and regular. The successor of the deposed king, the third Edward, ushers in the complete and central period of the Middle Ages in England. The feudal system is complete. The life and spirit of the country has developed into a condition, if not quite independent, yet quite forgetful, on the one hand of the ideas and customs of the Celtic and Teutonic tribes, and on the other of the authority of the Roman Empire. The Middle Ages have grown into manhood. That manhood has an art of its own which, though developed step by step from that of old Rome and New Rome, and embracing the strange mysticism and dreamy beauty of the East, has forgotten both its father and its mother, and stands alone triumphant, the loveliest, brightest, and gayest of all the creations of the human mind and hand. It has a literature of its own, too, somewhat akin to its art, yet inferior to it, and lacking its unity, since there is a double stream in it. On the one hand is the court poet, the gentleman, Chaucer, with his Italianizing metres, and his formal recognition of the classical stories, on which, indeed, he builds a superstructure of the quaintest and most unadulterated medievalism, as gay and bright as the architecture which his eyes beheld and his pen pictured for us. So clear, defined, and elegant it is. A sunny world even amidst its violence and passing troubles, like those of a happy child, the worst of them an amusement rather than a grief to the onlookers. A world that scarcely needed hope in its eager life of adventure and love, amidst the sunlit blossoming meadows and green woods and white begilded manor-houses. A kindly and human muse is Chaucer's, nevertheless, interested in and amused by all life, but of her very nature devoid of strong aspirations for the future. And that all the more, since, though the strong devotion and fierce piety of the ruder Middle Ages had by this time waned, and the Church was more often lightly mocked at than either feared or loved, still the habit of looking on this life as part of another yet remained. The world is fair and full of adventure. Kind men and true and noble are in it to make one happy. Fools also to laugh at, and rascals to be resisted, yet not wholly condemned. And when this world is over, we shall still go on living in another which is a part of this. Look at all the picture, note all and live in all, and be as merry as you may, never forgetting that you are alive and that it is good to live. That is the spirit of Chaucer's poetry. But alongside of it existed yet the ballad poetry of the people, wholly untouched by courtly elegance and classical pedantry, rude in art but never coarse, true to the backbone, instinct with indignation against wrong, and thereby expressing the hope that was in it, a protest of the poor against the rich, especially in those songs of the foresters, which have been called the medieval epic of revolt. No more gloomy than the gentleman's poetry, yet cheerful from courage and not content. Half a dozen stanzas of it are worth a cartload of the whining introspective lyrics of today, and he who, when he has mastered the slight differences of language from our own daily speech, is not moved by it, does not understand what true poetry means, nor what its aim is. There is a third element in the literature of this time which you may call Lollard poetry, the great example of which is William Langland's Piers Plowman. It is no bad corrective to Chaucer, and in form at least belongs wholly to the popular side. But it seems to me to show symptoms of the spirit of the rising middle class, and casts before it the shadow of the new master that was coming forward for the workman's oppression. But I must leave what more I have to say on this subject of the art and literature of the 14th century for another occasion. In what I have just said, I only wanted to point out to you that the Middle Ages had by this time come to the fullest growth, and that they could express in a form which was all their own the ideas and life of the time. That time was in a sense brilliant and progressive, and the life of the worker in it was better than it ever had been, and might compare with advantage with what it became in after periods and with what it is now. And indeed, looking back upon it, there are some minds and some moods that cannot help regretting it, and are not particularly scared by the idea of its violence and its lack of accurate knowledge of scientific detail. However, one thing is clear to us now, the kind of thing which never is clear to most people living in such periods, namely that, whatever it was, it could not last, but must change into something else. The complete feudalism of the 14th century fell, as systems always fall, by its own corruption, and by development of the innate seeds of change, some of which indeed had lain asleep during centuries, to wake up into activity long after the events which had created them were forgotten. The feudal system was naturally one of open war, and the alliances, marriages, and other dealings, family with family, made by the king and potentates, were always leading them into war by giving them legal claims, or at least claims that could be legally pleaded, to the domains of other lords, who took advantage of their being on the spot, of their strength in men or money, or their popularity with the baronage, to give immediate effect to their claims. Such a war was that by which Edward I drew on England the enmity of the Scotch, and such again was the great war which Edward III entered into with France. You must not suppose that there was anything in this war of a national, far less of a race character. The last series of wars, before this time I am now speaking of, in which race feelings counted for much, was the Crusades. This French war, I say, was neither national, racial, or tribal. It was the private business of a lord of the manor, claiming what he considered his legal rights of another lord, who had, as he thought, usurped them. And this claim his loyal feudatories were bound to take up for him. Loyalty to a feudal superior, not patriotism to a country, was the virtue which Edward III's soldiers had to offer, if they had any call to be virtuous in that respect. This war, once started, was hard to drop, partly because of the success that Edward had in it, falling as he did on France with the force of a country so much more homogeneous than it. And no doubt it was a war very disastrous to both countries, and so may be reckoned as amongst the causes which broke up the feudal system. But the real causes of that break-up lay much deeper than that. The system was not capable of expansion and production. It was, in fact, as long as its integrity remained untouched, an army fed by slaves, who could not be properly and closely exploited. Its freemen proper might do something else in their leisure, and so produce art and literature, but their true business as members of a conquering tribe, their concerted business, was to fight. There was indeed a fringe of people between the serf and the free noble who produced the matters of handicraft which were needed for the latter, but deliberately, and as we should now think, wastefully. And as these craftsmen and traders began to grow into importance and to push themselves, as they could not help doing, into the feudal hierarchy, as they acquired status, so the sickness of the feudal system increased on it, and the shadow of the coming commercialism fell upon it. That any set of people who could claim to be other than the property of free men should not have definite rights differentiated sharply from those of other groups was an idea that did not occur to the Middle Ages. Therefore, as soon as men came into existence that were not serfs and were not nobles, they had to struggle for status by organizing themselves into associations that should come to be acknowledged members of the great feudal hierarchy. For indefinite and negative freedom was not allowed to any person in those days. If you had not status, you did not exist, except as an outlaw. This is, briefly speaking, the motive power of necessity that lay behind the struggle of the town corporations and craft guilds to be free, a struggle which, though it was to result in the breaking up of the medieval hierarchy, began by an appearance of strengthening it by adding to its members, increasing its power of production, and so making it more stable for the time being. About this struggle and the kind of life which accompanied it I may have to write another time, and so will not say more about it here, except this, that it was much furthered by the change that gradually took place between the landlords and the class on whom all society rested, the serfs. These at first were men who had no more rights than chattel slaves had, except that mostly as part of the stock of the manor they could not be sold off it. They had to do all the work of the manor and to earn their own livelihood of it as they best could. But as the power of production increased owing to better methods of working, and as the country got to be more settled, their task-work became easier of performance and their own land more productive to them. And that tendency to the definition and differentiation of rights, moreover, was at work for their benefit, and the custom of the manor defined what their services were, and they began to acquire rights. From that time they ceased to be pure serfs, and began to tend towards becoming tenants, at first paying purely and simply service for their holdings, but gradually commuting that service for fines and money payment, for rent, in short. Towards the close of the 14th century, after the country had been depopulated by the Black Death and impoverished by the Long War, the feudal lords of these copyholders and tenants began to regret the slackness with which their predecessors had exploited their property, the serfs, and to consider that under the new commercial light which had begun to dawn upon them, they could do it much better, if they only had their property a little more in hand. But it was too late, for their property had acquired rights, and therewithal had got strange visions into their heads of a time much better than that in which they lived, when even those rights should be supplanted by a condition of things in which the assertion of rights for any one set of men should no longer be needed, since all men should be free to enjoy the fruits of their own labour. Of that came the great episode of the Peasants' War, led by men like Wat Tyler, Jack Straw, and John Ball, who indeed with those they led suffered for daring to be before their time, for the revolt was put down with cruelty worthy of an Irish landlord or a sweating capitalist of the present day. But nevertheless serfdom came to an end in England, if not because of the revolt, yet because of the events that made it, and thereby a death wound was inflicted on the feudal system. From that time onward the country, passing through the various troubles of a new French War of Henry V's time and the War of the Roses, did not heed these faction fights much. The workmen grew in prosperity, but also they began to rise into a new class, and a class beneath them of mere labourers who were not serfs began to form and to lay the foundations of capitalistic production. England got carried into the rising current of commercialism, and the rich men and landlords to turn their attention to the production of profit instead of the production of livelihood. The guildless journeyman and the landless labourer slowly came into existence. The landlord got rid of his tenants all he could, turned tillage into pasture, and sweated the pastures to death in his eagerness for wool, which for him meant money and the breeding of money, till at last the place of the serf, which had stood empty as it were during a certain transition period, during which the non-capitalistic production was expanding up to its utmost limit, was filled by the proletarian working for the service of a master in a new fashion. A fashion which exploited and, woe worth the while, exploits him very much more completely than the customs of the manner of the feudal period. The life of the worker and the production of goods in this transition period, when feudal society was sickening for its end, is a difficult and wide subject that requires separate treatment. At present I will leave the medieval workman at the full development of that period which found him a serf bound to the manor, and which left him generally a yeoman or an artisan, sharing the collective status of his guild. The workman of today, if he could realize the position of his forerunner, has some reason to envy him. The feudal serf worked hard and lived poorly, and produced a rough livelihood for his master, whereas the modern workman, working harder still and living little if any better than the serf, produces for his master a state of luxury of which the old lord of the manor never dreamed. The workman's powers of production are multiplied 1,000-fold. His own livelihood remains pretty much where it was. The balance goes to his master and the crowd of useless, draggle-tailed knaves and fools who pander to his idiotic sham desires, and who, under the pretentious title of the intellectual part of the middle classes, have in their turn taken the place of the medieval jester. Truly, if the positivist motto, "Live for others," be taken in stark literality, the modern workman should be a good and wise man, since he has no chance of living for himself. And yet I wish he were wiser still, wise enough to make an end of the preaching of "live on others," which is the motto set forth by commercialism to her favoured children. Yet in one thing the modern proletarian has an advantage over the medieval serf, and that advantage is a world in itself. Many a century lay between the serf and successful revolt, and though he tried it many a time and never lost heart, yet the coming change which his martyrdom helped on was not to be for him yet, but for the new masters of his successors. With us it is different. A few years of wearisome struggle against apathy and ignorance, a year or two of growing hope, and then, who knows, perhaps a few months or perhaps a few days of the open struggle against brute force with the mask off its face and the sword in its hand, and then we are over the bar. Who knows, I say? Yet this we know, that ahead of us, with nothing betwixt us except such incidents as are necessary to its development, lies the inevitable social revolution, which will bring about the end of mastery and the triumph of fellowship. End of section 4.